Welcome to Everlutionary, a podcast about how we can restore balance and heal the world. Every episode of my show, we explore the future of humanity and how we've gotten to where we are today. Through inspirational stories about healing, science, and mysticism, we'll see how we can reshape our society to create a world free of violence. I'm your host, Hawah Kasat. Peace, peace, peace. Everyone, welcome back to the Everlutionary podcast experience. I'm your host, Hawah Kasat, always here trying to bring you honest and real reflections on relationships, healing, and justice, rooted in science, mysticism, philosophy, and the healing arts. You hit play today on my solo episode, where I'm reflecting on Women's History Month and International Women's Day, and the deep need I see for us to find more balance in how feminine and masculine energies are expressed, heard, integrated, and honored within our world. If you've been listening to me for a while, then you know how important this issue is to my heart and how I think global planetary healing requires a deep shift in how men show up in the world. So let's get into it. One of my most vivid memories when I was a kid was when I was in the backseat of my parents' car. My sister, who was a year and a half older than me, was sitting next to me. On this day, while we were on some long drive, I remember seeing her staring out the window in deep contemplation. Every now and then, she'd stop staring and start scribbling away into her notebook. I watched her doing this for a little while, and then I became curious. I asked her, "What are you writing?" She said, "I'm writing a poem." I was pretty young, I think maybe like 10 years old, and so I asked her what a poem was. She gave me some explanation, and I can't remember exactly what she said, but I started to understand that writing a poem required me to reflect on what I was seeing and trying to place words to the emotions and the thoughts I was having. Sometimes in a way where these words could rhyme or have a certain cadence or relationship to the sentences before. I asked her if she could read to me what she was writing, and she did. The poem she was writing, she had titled Why. And there was a depth of contemplation in the poem that made me think about life outside of myself. And more importantly, about the feelings that other creatures might feel when we hurt them. She asked me if I wanted to help her write some lines. It was a generous invitation that altered my relationship to poetry. We looked out the window together and up at the sky, and she pointed to these large birds flying through the clouds. And then she asked me, "What do you think about those birds?" I can't remember how the verse in the poem really came to be, but either way, at some point in the poem, it read, "While birds were choking and flying through toxic black clouds." And I started thinking about the birds and whether or not the birds had feelings or emotions. Having an older sister in my life, and not just an older sister, but a thoughtful, caring, generous, and smart older sister, played such an important role in shaping my character and building my perspective and empathy. My sister was connected to her emotions, and by being around her, it gave me an opportunity to see that there were ways for me to be in the world that didn't require me to shut myself off from my emotions. Men, we often sever the ties to our emotions. From an early age, we're taught that vulnerability is something to be hidden. We learn that tears are for the weak and that showing emotion is a crack in the armor. We're told to man up, to stop being soft, to just push through. And so we bury our feelings deep within, as though the very act of feeling might betray us. But in doing so, we lose something really precious. Men, we lose the fullness of who we are. Now, I know this episode is going to be about women and honoring women, but it's hard to do that without also unpacking exactly how men, we are so deeply connected to the ways that women are able to show up and be in the world, right? Men, we've been conditioned to believe that emotion is a weakness. But in truth, it's our strength, our humanity, our connection to one another. This disconnection isn't just a private battle, it spills out, shaping how we interact with the world. Men often find it difficult to ask for help, to lean on others when they're struggling. There's a fear, a deep-rooted instinct that asking for support is a sign of failure. Instead, we turn inward, holding our burdens like heavy stones in a bag that we refuse to put down. And we carry these heavy bags for our entire lives. When we're hurting, men, we lock our pain away, thinking that if we don't show it, we won't be seen as weak. This silent struggle keeps us isolated, far from the people who could offer us comfort, far from the connections that could heal us. Now, I'm not talking about all men. There's always exceptions to the rule, and I know that there's men listening right now that are able to not fall into the cultural norms that we've been conditioned into with our behavior. But I am talking about men in general. In general, this is a common occurrence that we can discover through mental health science. Men are less likely to talk about their struggles with depression or anxiety, and the statistics tell a sobering story. A 2019 study found that men are significantly less likely to seek help for mental health issues. Why? Because somewhere along the way, we were taught that facing our own vulnerability is something we must bear alone. The result is a society and a world where emotional pain festers beneath the surface, untreated, unspoken, and unchecked. Too often we wear our stoicism as a mask, a false armor that hides our true selves. And then there's anger, the emotion we've been taught to wield like a weapon. Anger is the only acceptable outlet, the only feeling men are allowed to express without shame. But anger, when it isn't understood or processed, is a storm without a purpose. It clouds our judgment. It distorts our vision. How many times have we felt the fury rise, only to realize later that it wasn't the cause but the cover for something deeper? Our hurt, our fear, our grief. Anger unchecked becomes a mask we wear to shield ourselves from the tenderness of other emotions. And in doing so, we cut off the very possibility of healing. Think of the quiet distance it creates in our relationships. How many times have we hidden our true selves behind a mask of "I'm fine" when everything inside was unraveling? How many times have we withdrawn, afraid of what might happen if we let down the walls we built? This emotional disconnect doesn't just isolate us, it leaves those we love standing in the shadows, unsure of what we need, unsure of how to help. It stifles connection, it stifles intimacy, and it stifles the very thing that makes us human, the ability to share our hearts, our fears, and our dreams. It stifles women from being able to be women. But here's the truth. Emotion is not our enemy. It is a signal, a part of our story, a thread that ties us to the world around us. It's okay to feel. It's okay to be sad, to be afraid, to be vulnerable. These aren't weaknesses, they are windows into the transformation. The strength we long for is not the strength to suppress, but the strength to feel deeply, to embrace every part of ourselves without fear or shame. And so this moment in the backseat of the car with my sister was an inspiration for me to explore poetry deeply through my youth and into adulthood. The language of poetry requires connection to feelings. I think for me, a poet has to be sensitive, and this is sometimes the opposite of what is expected by men and society. Throughout my childhood, my sister served as this person who would remind me or check me when I was acting in ways that were distanced from my emotions, when I was acting in ways that were distanced from kindness or empathy. My sister helped me see my blind spots, helped me reflect on my behavior as a young boy turning into a young man who otherwise may have drifted through the world not as aware of my unconscious, implicit biases. Whether that was towards women or whether that was towards any person because of their race, gender, or religion. My sister was one of many feminine influences who inspired me and who I believe are responsible for making me a better man. I know I am far, far, far from perfect. But one thing I can say with all of my heart is that I constantly am working on myself as an artist may be working on their masterpiece. My life, as most likely yours, has been shaped and nurtured by powerful, wise, caring, and resilient women. None of us would be here without you. It seems silly for me to even have to say that. But sometimes in our world, I feel like men, we just may forget. And so this is my reminder to all the men listening. Let's listen more deeply. Men, let's make sure we don't need a Women's History Month to remind us of women's contributions to the world. Honestly, we only need the month because of the gap. Could you imagine a world where we would need a Men's History Month? No, you couldn't. I couldn't, because men are already the center of everything. And the stark power imbalance is why, in the United States, we need to have a Women's History Month, or why there is even any such thing as an International Women's Day. For far too long, women's voices have been stifled or ignored, their contributions undervalued. And if history has taught us anything, it's that this imbalance hasn't merely cost women their rightful opportunities, it's robbed humanity of its potential. From the highest levels of governance to the heart of our everyday communities, a skewed emphasis on masculine qualities, such as competition, aggression, short-term gain, extraction of natural resources, all this has stunted our collective growth. For centuries, a patriarchal framework has dominated much of human society, shaping our political, economic, and cultural institutions, systems, and norms. And even our collective imagination of what leadership looks like. This framework often prizes aggression over diplomacy, competition over collaboration, and short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Although it has driven technological advances and spurred economic growth in some places, we now see the pervasive negative effects of this unbalanced patriarchal approach. It results in societal inequality, environmental crisis, political stalemates, and widespread burnout. These are just a few of the symptoms pointing to the need for a different way forward. If we pause and look carefully, it becomes evident that our current imbalances are not merely byproducts of chance, but the consequences of systems that have overly emphasized masculine traits at the expense of feminine qualities. When I speak of masculine and feminine here, I'm not referring strictly to men versus women or male versus female. I'm speaking of energies, the archetypes traditionally associated with each gender. Masculine energy, in a broad sense, is linked to action, linear thinking, competition, and external achievement. Feminine energy, on the other hand, is often associated with intuition, empathy, nurturing, collaboration, and holistic thinking. Both are valuable and necessary, and each of us, regardless of gender identity, can embody aspects of both. The issue arises when one is prized or valued far above the other, creating an imbalance that reverberates throughout our institutions and communities. So, what I'm saying is that the rise of women is not about the fall of men. I'm going to say that again. What I'm saying is that the rise of women, it's not about the fall of men. It's not about lifting women into positions of higher importance or value or power than men. It's about having an equal balance of power between men and women. And also all those between who identify neither as man or woman. For much of modern human history, women were systematically excluded from rights, opportunities, and freedoms that are today considered basic. In the United States, it wasn't until the 1970s that women gained the right to apply for a credit card in their own name. Think about that. Prior to 1970, a married woman could not open a credit card without her husband's approval and without her husband's name on the card. Even more shockingly, for much of the 20th century, women could not legally file for divorce in many states unless their husbands consented. This gave men an overwhelming control over a woman's personal and financial autonomy, often trapping women in abusive or unsatisfactory marriages. Until the late 1800s, in most Western countries, women could not even own property independently of their husbands or fathers. If a woman inherited land or wealth, it was often passed to her male relatives because she was considered legally incompetent to manage her own affairs. Women were systematically excluded from higher education until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The first women's colleges were established only in the 1830s, and it wasn't until the 1970s, following the passage of Title IX, that federal legislation was enacted to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in educational programs. Prior to that, women were often actively discouraged from pursuing higher education, especially in male-dominated fields like law, medicine, and engineering. Women of color in particular have faced compounded barriers to success, In addition to the sexism that has historically restricted women's opportunities, racial discrimination has often kept women of color from gaining the same opportunities afforded to white women. African American women were often excluded from the suffrage movement, with white suffragists prioritizing the rights of white women and leaving women of color marginalized. In many countries, the oppression of women was legally codified well into the 20th century. In France, it wasn't until 1965 that women were allowed to work without their husband's permission. 1965, y'all, that is not very long ago. And in Switzerland, women only gained the right to vote in federal elections in 1971. And even then, many local jurisdictions in Switzerland delayed this change until the 1990s. The 1990s. That's 30 years ago. These examples, they just shed light on the tremendous barriers that women have faced historically. Women's bodies were treated as property. Their legal autonomy was limited, and their ability to participate in public life was restricted. These systemic oppressions were so deeply ingrained that they were often invisible to those in power, rendering the injustices of women's experiences invisible and making any attempt at social change difficult to achieve. Today, we are still seeing the echoes of this oppression. Consider our global leadership landscape. According to the United Nations, only around 28% of parliamentary seats worldwide are held by women, and less than 10% of the world's heads of state are women. In the corporate world, a 2022 analysis by Catalyst revealed that less than 9% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women. This figure has slowly inched upward over the years, but still indicates that men hold the overwhelming majority of top leadership positions. When we stop to consider that women make up roughly half of the global population, the disparity in leadership roles is glaring. This gap is not just a matter of numerical imbalance, it represents countless lost opportunities for innovation, empathy-driven policy, and cooperative solutions that might emerge from more diverse leadership teams. And when women are given equal chances to lead, the tone and the policies begin to shift accordingly. Many studies point to correlations between higher female representation in governmental bodies and the enactment of more comprehensive policies related to childcare, healthcare, family leave, and social welfare. A 2019 study by the Council on Foreign Relations suggests that countries with more women in parliament tend to allocate a larger portion of their budgets to education and public health, potentially reflecting the empathetic, long-term thinking so often labeled as feminine leadership traits. These same traits often translate into corporate success. A McKinsey and Company report in 2020 found that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on executive teams were 25% more likely to experience above average profitability compared to companies in the bottom quartile. These patterns illustrate that more balanced leadership teams that incorporate a variety of perspectives, experiences, and leadership styles tend to yield better outcomes. With so many modern crises, climate change, social inequality, public health challenges, all demanding long-range, cooperative, and inclusive solutions, the absence of feminine leadership in decision-making rooms is tragic and heartbreaking and should be a wake-up call for all the men who are listening right now. If you're a woman, please send this to some men in your life that need to hear it from another man. Here is where we can look to history for guidance. While it might seem that patriarchal systems have always reigned supreme, and I hear that sometimes from other speakers and on other podcasts, that we've been living under the patriarchy for thousands of years. But a closer look at sociology, history, and culture will tell us a different story. There are notable examples of indigenous societies from around the world that place significant value on balanced governance. We can look at the Iroquois Confederacy or the Iroquois Nation. The Iroquois traditionally inhabited large swaths of what is now the northeastern United States, including what we recognize today as New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and parts of Canada. Composed of many nations, the Confederacy formed a sophisticated political and social structure centuries ago to foster unity and cooperation among the tribes. While much of European governance of the time emphasized monarchies, conquests, and strict hierarchies, the Iroquois developed a league grounded in principles of consensus, communal responsibility, and respect for the natural world. Their system, often referred to as the Great Law of Peace, included checks and balances that even influenced some of the founding concepts behind the United States Constitution. This influence is often minimized in mainstream historical accounts. A key component that set the Iroquois Confederacy apart was the elevated position of women in governance, specifically the women known as clan mothers. They held extraordinary authority in appointing and deposing the male chiefs, who represented the clans in the Grand Council. The power of these clan mothers was neither symbolic nor ceremonial. They were responsible for ensuring that the chiefs upheld their duties ethically and faithfully. If a chief acted contrary to the welfare of his people, the clan mother who selected him could also remove him from his position. This mechanism effectively wove feminine leadership into the very fabric of the Confederacy's political processes, ensuring that the perspective of women and the qualities typically deemed feminine were embedded in leadership decisions. And yet the chiefs, often embodying masculine energies of action and negotiation, also had their vital role to play. The result was a system that, at its best, honored both masculine and feminine energies. To truly appreciate this, we have to understand the oral tradition that underpinned the Iroquois worldview. Much of the Confederacy's history and cosmology is preserved not through written texts, but through spoken word and communal storytelling. Elders would pass these stories down through generations. One of the central creation stories involves Sky Woman, who fell from the sky world into the waters below. Various animals, recognizing her vulnerability, assisted her in creating land on the back of a great turtle, which is why North America is sometimes poetically referred to as Turtle Island. Sky Woman gave birth to twin sons, Sapling and Flint. Despite their opposing natures, one embodying creation and the other embodying destruction, Sapling and Flint worked together in a broader cosmic sense to shape and balance the world. In this and similar Iroquois stories, the earth itself is understood as a living entity, often referred to as Mother Earth, reflecting a belief that the land is something to be respected, honored, and cared for. The Iroquois Confederacy was not the only culture and civilization that placed such emphasis on ensuring that women had a decisive voice in selecting and guiding and orchestrating social, political, economic, and cultural aspects of society. We could learn much from the Akan, people of Ghana, the Khasi, people of India, the Bribri of Panama and Costa Rica, the Himba of Namibia, the Tuareg of North Africa, and the Aymara, people of Bolivia and Peru. So many examples, modern and ancient, of more balanced empowerment between feminine and masculine energies, between men and women. Now, I'm not saying that all masculine qualities are destructive. Far from it. I really do believe that action, decisiveness, strategic thinking, and drive are all necessary components of any robust leadership model. However, in a world where so many challenges are interconnected and require nuanced, cooperative solutions, the exclusion of feminine energies represents, in my opinion, humanity's greatest downfall. If you're a man listening to this, I ask you, how can we make culturally part of our normal discourse the importance of feminine leadership? As men, we are the ones who have the privilege and the power to reimagine masculine leadership. Feminism is not just for women, it's a movement for everyone, one that seeks to dismantle patriarchy and create a world where all people, regardless of gender, can live more fully and authentically. One of my great inspirations is author, scholar, activist, and feminist Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks emphasized reclaiming masculinity from the confines of patriarchy. Bell Hooks argued that traditional rigid forms of masculinity, rooted in dominance, control, and emotional repression, are as harmful to men as they are to women. Hear what she says about patriarchy in a speech she gave here.
Many of the critics who've written about masculinity suggest that we need to do away with the term, that we need an end to manhood. Yet such a stance furthers the notion that there's something inherently evil, bad, or unworthy about maleness. The crisis facing men is not the crisis of masculinity. It is the crisis of patriarchal masculinity. Until we make this distinction clear, men will continue to fear that any critique of patriarchy represents a threat. To offer men and women, boys and girls, a different way of being, we must first replace the dominator model with a partnership model that sees interbeing and interdependency as the organic relationship of all living beings. Love cannot exist in any relationship that is based on domination and coercion. When men embrace feminist thinking and practice, which emphasizes the value of mutual growth and self-actualization in all relationships, their emotional well-being will be enhanced. In the partnership model, selfhood, whether one is female or male, is always at the core of one's identity.
Here, Bell Hooks teaches us that patriarchy doesn't only affect women, it limits men by pushing us into narrow, destructive roles that stifle our emotional and relational capacities. Men, we're taught that to be real men, we must distance ourselves from our feelings, our empathy, and our cooperation. This is one of the most damaging aspects of masculine norms. Men, like women, we're socialized into a system that forces us to deny important parts of ourselves. The path forward, according to bell hooks, requires a transformation that is not only about empowering women, but also about freeing men from the suffocating constraints of traditional masculinity. If you haven't already, then be sure to read her book, The Will to Change: Men, Masculinity, and Love. I've read this book multiple times, and women listening, this is a book that I recommend you gift to the brothers, the fathers, the uncles, nephews, and male friends in your life. In one of my favorite passages, bell hooks writes, "Feminism is for everybody. The aim of the feminist movement is not just about liberating women, it is about liberating us all, men, women, children, and our society as a whole from the toxic legacies of patriarchy." End quote. In this way, feminist principles become a roadmap for collective healing. Men, by embracing feminism, we can liberate ourselves from the chains of emotional repression and destructive behaviors that patriarchy imposes. Bell Hooks' vision of feminism calls on men to acknowledge their emotional depth and embrace vulnerability as a source of strength rather than weakness. Only by embracing these qualities can men contribute meaningfully to the world's transformation and support a more inclusive, just, and loving society. Men, for us to truly honor women, we need to step into this role. We need to unlearn the harmful narratives we've been taught about power, vulnerability, and our place in society. We must confront our own complicity in systems that perpetuate inequality. We need to be active participants in the creation of more balanced, inclusive leadership structures. This is not about us becoming less masculine or giving up our agency, but rather about embracing a fuller, more compassionate vision of ourselves as people who can lead with empathy and strength. Men, it's not our fault that we've inherited this legacy. For those alive today, right now, it might not be our fault, but it is our responsibility. It's our responsibility to change the dominant, oppressive narrative through our behavior. Men's involvement in feminist movements is crucial to achieving the type of balance we're discussing in leadership today. Feminist movements have historically been labeled as women's issues. But as bell hooks emphasizes, the movement to challenge patriarchy and promote equality must include men as partners in this work. Dismantling patriarchal structures will lead not only to a more just world for women, but also to more fulfilling and authentic lives for men. This is what time it is. It's not just a month. It's a radical reimagining of leadership, which values connection over power and emotional intelligence over rigid control. This offers a transformative way forward for individuals, organizations, and entire nations. Feminine leadership rooted in collaboration, empathy, and long-term vision has the potential to heal divisions, bridge differences, and address the global challenges we face. Frankly, it is what we need to do if we really want to escape the sixth mass extinction. If I had it my way, I would lift women up into leadership positions in every sector: politics, business, education, healthcare, the entertainment industry, and beyond. But this is not just a zero-sum game for me. Feminine leadership is not about excluding men or disempowering us. It's about creating balance, a space where both feminine and masculine energies can coexist and complement each other. In a more balanced leadership system, men will be liberated from the restrictive roles we have been assigned. Instead of being trapped in a binary framework of dominance and submission, men can move toward a model of leadership that values collaboration, mutual respect, and inclusivity. It's not just about women fighting for equality. It's about all genders working together to break down the outdated structures that prevent everyone from thriving. Men's liberation is, in fact, integral to women's liberation. Feminine leadership has always been pivotal in grassroots movements against oppression. Many of the most visible and successful social and environmental campaigns around the world are led by women who are mobilizing communities through empathy-driven storytelling and inclusive organizing. From indigenous women fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest, to female-led organizations championing local sustainable farming in Africa, these movements often thrive because their leaders encourage collective ownership of both problems and solutions. So how do we chart a path forward that allows for a truly harmonious balance of feminine and masculine energies in leadership? One strategy is definitely to implement policy and structural changes that actively encourage women to rise into leadership roles. We need to have quotas for women on corporate boards. Unfortunately, much of this is being stripped away and dismantled right now through the current US political leadership, who are actively gutting diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives and programs. Even though these DEI programs have been shown to accelerate gender balance in countries that adopt them. DEI initiatives aren't just about representation, they're about actively addressing the historical and cultural inequalities that have kept women, particularly women of color, marginalized. When we talk about empowering women, we need to understand that the work is not just about allowing women to participate, but about dismantling the systems that have historically kept them from reaching their true and full potential. When we see diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives being gutted, we must understand that this is being done by the same men who want nothing more than to maintain and retain the reins of power and control. Education is another pivotal factor. By integrating teachings about balanced leadership into school curriculum, we can nurture future generations to value empathy, cooperation, and inclusivity as much as or more than competition and individual achievement. Children who learn about the figures like the Iroquois clan mothers, or discover the creation cosmology of Sky Woman and the importance of both sapling and flint, can grow to appreciate the synergy between masculine and feminine energies. This holistic approach to leadership education can begin to dismantle the cultural myths that equate strength solely with masculine aggression or misconstrue empathy as a weakness. Instead, strength becomes the capacity to listen, to adapt, and to hold the needs of the collective at the center. Individual action also matters. We can look at our workplaces, communities, and social circles and identify ways to promote feminine leadership qualities. This can mean amplifying the voices of women in meetings, providing a platform for collaborative decision-making, or volunteering for initiatives that emphasize nurturing and communal well-being. Men in positions of power can play a critical role by stepping aside when appropriate, to make space for women's contributions, and by modeling an approach to leadership that values empathy and vulnerability alongside determination and strategic thinking. Far from diminishing men's importance, this expansion of acceptable leadership traits enriches everyone's capacity to lead. When people hear the phrase men stepping aside, they sometimes misunderstand it as men having no part to play. The goal is not to swing the pendulum to an exclusively feminine form of leadership, but to restore balance. Men can exemplify and champion feminine qualities just as women can exhibit strong masculine traits. Indeed, some of the most effective leaders are those who seamlessly integrate a wide spectrum of competencies. It's about creating a world that respects and values a full range of human capacities. The essence of the Iroquois Confederacy's wisdom lies in the idea that no single energy should dominate. The clan mothers did not rule alone, they chose chiefs who brought different skills to the table. Yet the women retained the authority to keep the system in check, ensuring that moral principles remained at the heart of governance. This interplay, when functioning properly, is a dance of balance, a reflection of nature's own rhythms. The earth has its seasons, each complementing and succeeding the other, never eternally fixed in one mode of being. Societies, too. We rotate through different modes of leadership, each guided by the overarching intention of collective well-being. So consider your own environment and ask, where can more feminine leadership qualities be introduced? What structures or habits might we dissolve if they inhibit empathy, cooperation, or long-term vision? How can we encourage the emergence of new leaders, whether they identify as women, men, or non-binary, who personify the integration of both masculine and feminine energies? And how can each of us embody these qualities in our daily lives, interactions, and personal growth? Ultimately, the need for feminine leadership is not just about uplifting one gender over the other. It's about remembering the fundamental principle of balance. I know that I could do an entire podcast show, not just an episode or two, on this topic. I'll certainly continue to explore this theme in future episodes. In the meantime, please turn to the show notes for some resources and links to books and further learning on this topic. If you're inspired by what you heard, please share it with a friend and post a link to your social media account. Hit that subscribe button and drop a rating, drop a review, help push the Everlutionary podcast further out into the world. And also, in the show notes are the links if you want to stay connected with me on social media or come to one of my retreats or online program offerings. Become a paid subscriber to my Substack page if you want to help support all the time and energy that I put into making and producing this show. As always, stay in touch and stay in love. Everlutionary, restoring balance and healing the natural world, is brought to you by me, Hawah Kasat. If you would like to find out more about me and my story, head to hawah.us. That's HAWAH.US. And then make sure to search for me in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thank you for listening. Stay in touch. Peace.